It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting. It's interesting.
Welcome to It's So Interesting, where people talk about their work and life experience. I am George Spitzer. I have with me today John Hughes, who has had an extended career in journalism, and we'll discuss that for the next few minutes. I would like to get right to it. How many years have you been at the Christian Science Monitor?
Well, it's over 20. I was editor for 9 years, and I was Africa correspondent for the Monitor for 6 years, and then I was in Asia for 6 years, and of course I had some spells back in the Home Office as assistant foreign editor, so it's well over 20 years.
That's a long time.
And I wrote a column for a long time after that.
How many years did you write in the column afterwards?
Up to 25, 30 years, yeah.
So we're talking over 50 years affiliation with the Christian Science Monitor.
Well, there certainly are.
Right, and you've done a lot of other things, which we will cover shortly. But I want to start in the very beginning. When I read in your book, Paperboy to Pulitzer, that you almost never became a journalist. Instead, you may have become a child actor.
Wasn't good enough to do it professionally.
Right. Well, apparently you were in the running for auditions with Roddy McDowall.
With Roddy McDowall. Roddy McDowall and I, this was at the end of World War II, and we were both on a sort of... there were stage mothers who had kids, and so they were doing auditions, they were doing modeling for magazines and so forth and so on. And Roddy and I were on that circuit together. And then came the audition for How Green Was My Valley, and he made it and I flunked it, and therefore I went to journalism and he went to stardom.
So if you actually got selected during that audition, you may have never become a journalist?
It's possible, although I have to tell you that journalism is in my bones. It is the most wonderful profession that I can imagine, and I suspect that I would have gone anyway the journalism route in the end.
In other words, you couldn't be kept away from it.
I couldn't be kept away. I keep telling, I teach at a university, and I tell my students, if you decide to become a journalist, even in these troubled times in the profession, you will never have a dull day in the rest of your life.
Which university is this?
Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah.
I'm curious. At what point did the light bulb go on in your thought saying, this is it? I want to be a journalist.
Well, I suppose it started in school. I went to a school that was quite a good school in London during war and shortly thereafter. And my physics master said it probably was a good idea if I didn't do anything in physics. And my chemistry master said it's probably a good idea, Hughes, if you don't do anything in chemistry. But my English teacher said, I think you have a talent for writing and you ought to go to the London School of Journalism. Never did that because my dad came back from World War II. He'd been in Africa, North Africa, but he'd also been in South Africa. And he decided that after he got back from 3 years in the desert to rainy old London, we were going to South Africa, and so he moved the family to South Africa, and that's how I started in journalism.
You were not involved in World War II itself because you were too young as a kid, right?
I was too young, but I'd sort of had my first love affair with newspapers because I delivered newspapers during the end of the war and shortly thereafter. And there, of course, in that time in London, there were about 6 major newspapers. And I had to deliver them to each interested person in the newspaper was very committed to that newspaper. If you delivered the wrong one of those 6, you were in trouble.
You actually carried all 6 with you?
Carried all 6 with you. And you had a schedule, who got what. You got the Times and then the News Chronicle and the other dailies there. And it was a great newspaper city, of course.
You were what, 12, 14?
Yeah, a little older than that. Yeah, about 14 probably.
And how heavy was the load?
It wasn't too bad. Of course, during the wartime part, you were sort of dodging things other than irate readers of newspapers.
In terms of the World War II experience, even as a young adult or teenager, and immediately thereafter, how much the World War II experience you witnessed as well as experienced affected your interest in journalism?
My dad was about 40-year-old when he was conscripted, and I had a serious talk with him and said, it's not fair. And of course I cried and said, they shouldn't take you, you're told. And he said, no, this is a war with a tremendous significance, and there are evil forces and good forces, and I think I've got to go. So off he went to the military at a fairly old age, and was sent to North Africa with Field Marshal Montgomery's army, and spent 3 years there. My mother was conscripted, as many women were in the war, to the post office. So I was left with my bicycle, or my bicycle, and had to get to school. And so you dodged air raids of the years, the V1s and V2s, the rockets started coming, you dodged those. And I delivered newspapers when I wasn't in school.
So you actually were delivering newspapers while you can hear the V1s and V2s flying overhead?
You delivered the newspapers early in the morning, and the V1s you could hear. There was put, 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 you could hear them, and they cut out, and then you took cover. The V2s you couldn't hear, they just hit. So there was no dodging those. Our house was never bombed, but we had an air raid shelter in the garden, and then eventually an air raid shelter in the house. It was kind of a steel box that the government issued to people, and the idea was that you crawled into this steel box and you were safe if your house was bombed, because you went down with the rubble and they could dig you out and you would be safe. But that never happened to us, but we did have windows blown out. My mother's principal crisis of the war, of World War II, was the loss of the week's sugar ration. Sugar was rationed. She had the week's ration. She put it in a bowl. She left it overnight on the kitchen table. That night, the windows in our house were blown out, and shards of glass were found in the sugar. She could not use the sugar. That's what she held against the Germans for the rest of the war.
That is a crisis. I can
That's
see
a
that.
crisis.
That's a crisis. Well, that's what's important, because you were living through World War II as a citizen, as a child, and then the next thing you know, for the next 60, 70 years, you're reporting on the similar situations around the world. I always was fascinated to know how you have, as a journalist, were able to deal with reporting the news without affecting the news. Because obviously when you write about an event, especially a revolution or something like that, what you write can have an effect on the events, either in the location you're reporting from or in other countries that are causing a problem. Do you think about that?
I do think about it. Very often you don't know what effect your writing is having. During my time in Africa, my territory was Africa south of the Sahara, but I was based in Cape Town in South Africa, spent a lot of time in South Africa, and it was during the bad old days of apartheid. I never met Nelson Mandela. I tried to, or many, many times the government wouldn't let me see him. He was in prison all that time, 20-something years, remarkable man. What I wrote about South Africa, I wrote what I believed to be the truth when I saw Africans being whipped with long whips by white South African policemen. I reported that. Obviously, my writing was not terribly favorable to the apartheid regime. I didn't really know what impact my writing was having. There were readers in South Africa who thought it was great, readers in South Africa, white readers, who were very opposed to what I wrote and tried to change my reporting, which I did not. What I did not know was something that happened long, long after Nelson Mandela was freed from prison. He came to the United States, and he went to Boston, and he said, "I need to visit the Christian Science Monitor." Whoever he told that to was surprised, but said, "Well, I will lead you to the Monitor's headquarters here in Boston," which he did. And they said, "Why do you want to go to the Christian Science Monitor?" He said, "Because the Christian Science Monitor was the only newspaper they allowed me to read all the years I was in prison."
And why was that?
I don't know. I have no idea.
Probably because it was considered a very balanced paper.
Well, I don't know that the apartheid government liked very much what I was writing, but I guess they thought it was balanced. I don't know.
You are the reason he wanted to show up at headquarters.
It happened. I never knew that until afterwards, when they received him and they feted him and so forth and so on. But he said the Monitor was the only newspaper I was allowed to read, and it kept me abreast of what was happening in the country.
I've heard of that story, but I never knew why, and you've just answered that, so thank you. The fact is, most of us know you won a Pulitzer.
Yes.
Most reporters, or anyone else who wins these trade prizes, don't write for the prize, and usually are, quote-unquote, surprised when it happens.
Yeah.
Were you surprised?
Yes, I had no idea that Monitor submitted me, my stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what was the prize for?
It was for my coverage of Indonesia, specifically the coup that the Indonesian Communist Party attempted with the aid of rebel military forces. The Indonesian Communist Party had become the third largest in the world after just Russia and China. It was very powerful. It wanted power. It had position in Parliament, but it wanted power. So they planned the murder. The army was not a fan of the Communist Party. In fact, some of the generals had trained in the United States and were more pro-American than Chinese. China was a big mentor for the Indonesian Communist Party. The Indonesian Communist Party launched a coup against the army. They killed and murdered the top 6 generals of the Indonesian army.
In one day?
In one night.
One night.
September the 30th of that year. They took the bodies to an Air Force base just outside of Jakarta, the capital, mutilated the bodies, threw the bodies down a well, and filled the wells afterwards. So a man called Suharto was on the list of those to be killed, but by good fortune had taken his son to go fishing on the ocean side that night. He came back to the capital, found out what had happened, tried to regroup the loyalist forces, eventually did, and put down the revolution, and then went on a huge murderous campaign across the country, killing communists. Killed as many as 800,000. I think that's a little high, but he certainly killed hundreds of thousands. They killed hundreds of thousands of people. I happen to have good source with one of the generals who was in charge of the para-commanders who were doing the alleged cleanup. It took a long time after that because Sukarno, I got the first interview with Sukarno after that took place, and that was fairly widely reported around the world. And Sukarno, to the chagrin of the loyalist generals, didn't put the Communist Party down, and so then there was a long period of terrible fighting, certainly in the capital of Jakarta. You had to watch where you were going, between loyalist and communist forces, and finally the army eased Sukarno out, and Suharto took over for a number of years. For much of the time, I was the only American correspondent, because they closed down the whole country. They closed the airport, they closed the telecommunications, the phones. There was a good friend of mine from the London Times, Fred Emery, and a guy, Don North, from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and we were the only 3 correspondents in the country. And so it was fairly unique coverage.
I've read about, through your book as well as other places, that much of reportage, the successful, incisive reportage, aside from methodical research, is serendipity.
Yes.
You have to be there.
Yes.
But you can't tell in advance. You need to be somewhere where there's going to be a crisis. You have to be there, and then the crisis hits.
Yeah.
How much of that do you feel affected you?
Well, it was very difficult to get in visas to get into Indonesia. I had a good friend in the American embassy who did a little work for me with the government, and I had been to Indonesia once before. I just arrived in my assignment in the Far East, and I'd been to Indonesia before, so I went in and made contacts before the coup. I happened to be back in covering the Philippine election when the balloon went up when they murdered these guys. I had a new visa that I hadn't used. I was holding for. I knew something was going to happen, and that was the time to play it. So I went there, and I thought I might not get in, and I was astonished when we went through customs and immigration, and the immigration officer said, "Welcome to Indonesia."
at that critical time.
Yeah, and then they dropped the boom. Nobody could get in after that.
Would you think the reputation of the Christian Science Monitor, aside from your own reputation as a reporter, helped you get in?
I think it did. The print Monitor was in its heyday in those days. It was up in the 200,000 circulation area, which is not. It's not the Washington Post or the New York Times circulation, but in those days the Monitor was voted certainly one of the 10 best newspapers in the United States, and sometimes one of the 3 best.
Yeah, I've heard about the 3. Yes,
and it was due to the amazing foresight of a woman, Mary Baker Eddy, who was head of the Christian Science Church, who said to her lieutenants around her, "We're going to start a new." She wasn't terribly enamored of the newspapers of the day. And she said, "We're going to start a newspaper." And in 1908, she did. And over the years, amazing acclaim in both national political coverage and in foreign coverage.
And the acclaim is based for what reason?
Well, she said that she didn't start a newspaper to make money, but she wanted it to bless all mankind. And blessing all mankind didn't mean ignoring evil, but it meant looking at evil and seeing whether there's not some solution to the evils and hardships of the times around the globe.
So it's a solutions-oriented.
Solution-oriented.
And
yes.
not always on the mechanical or physical solutions, but more in thought.
Exactly.
And that's where your reportage oiled that along, so to speak.
Yeah.
Fact is that you spent many, many decades involved or editing for the paper, but then you launched off on multiple careers afterwards. Tell me about some of those.
Well, I'd been editor of the Monitor. I'd been in Africa for 6 years, and I'd been in Asia for 6 years, and I'd been on the desk, assistant foreign editor for some time. I'd been to Harvard. I got a Nieman Fellow at Harvard for a year. Paper had supported that. And I came back, and I was editor for 9 years. It was a very interesting time, Watergate, where we had very divided readership, and they'd let us know they were divided. I used to have a pile of letters on one side of my desk saying the Monitor's coverage of President Nixon was absolutely horrendous and we should be ashamed of ourselves. And on the other side of the desk was a pile of newspapers saying, bravo, you're doing good work, keep on doing what you're doing. So it was an interesting time.
Well, that's balanced.
That's balanced. But anyway, the critics asked me to leave clubs I never joined, and, well, you know, it was a jolly time. But after about 10 years, I said, you know, I'd just like to own a newspaper or newspapers of myself. And to cut a long story short, I bought that newspaper and added other weeklies, and we had a little chain of about 5 or 6 weekly newspapers spread through Cape Cod and lower part of Massachusetts.
Is that why you now have white hair?
It was a wonderful, wonderful time. I enjoyed it much. You're very, very close. You're very, very close to your readers. I was a good friend with Scotty Reston, the famous New York Times columnist, who bought a newspaper on Martha's Vineyard, which is off Cape Cod. And I said, what can you tell me about running a newspaper, a little newspaper as distinct from the New York Times? He said, well, put it this way. At the New York Times, if I write about our relations with Russia and the nuclear situation and so forth and so on, I get maybe 20 letters to discuss this with me and maybe take issue with me. If you write something in the Vineyard Gazette people don't agree with, you get punched on the nose. Well, of course, he didn't get punched on the nose, but his point was you're living next to your readers and they tell you immediately what they like and what they don't like.
It makes it tough to go out for breakfast.
It makes it tough to go out for breakfast. That's exactly what he said.
Uh-huh. Interesting. And then after that?
Eventually we sold them. We grew them and we sold them. At some stage, I got a call from someone in Washington saying, come to Washington, talk with the director of the United States Information Agency. And he called, and I said, well, you know, I've got newspapers here and all the rest of it, and I've got things to go. No, he said, it's time for you to come and serve your country. It's with the Reagan administration. And I did go to Washington, and the director of the USA was a political lieutenant of Ronald Reagan. He'd been on the kitchen cabinet with Reagan in California and all the rest of it. And he said, John, I got to tell you, I don't know anything about newspapers, and I don't know anything about broadcasting, and I don't know much about foreign policy, but I can make things happen. And he could. He could call up his friend Ronnie. He would talk to Ronnie on the phone, and if he needed a new building, if you figure how long that would take through the normal bureaucratic structure of Washington, he got a new building. He got the agency renamed because in the Carter administration it had been changed to UICA, and then people confused it with the CIA. Of course, it wasn't. It's the agency that tells the story of America around the world. And so I went to Washington and became associate director under Charlie. Was there with the USA for a while. Loved it. We were running a huge media operation around the world. And then there was some little political trouble down at the Voice of America, and Charlie said, I want you to go down there and fix it. So I became director of the Voice of America, which I also loved. Marvelous institution, marvelous people working for it, including wonderful refugees from the countries to which they were broadcasting. I was walking down the corridor of VOA one day, and a little wispy gentleman walked out and started talking to me. It turned out he was from Vietnam. He was broadcasting on the Vietnamese service back to Vietnam. And as I talked about him, probed his background, he had 3 doctorates from the University of Hanoi, but was a refugee, had come to America, broadcasting back to his people. So that was fantastic. That was wonderful. But then George Shultz became Secretary of State, and I got a call from him, and he said, I want you to be my press secretary. I want you to be Associate Director of Public Affairs and State Department spokesman. And I loved George Shultz, man of enormous integrity. Worked for him, and he was a great guy to work for because he would recognize. Well, one time we were in Thailand, and he had given a press conference, and he had talked about a group of sort of free market military men who wanted to go into Laos.
Mercenaries. That's the word I was groping for. And somebody in the press conference, of course, said, "Well, so what do you think about this, Mr. Secretary?" And he said, "I think it's a good idea. I think we should do it." He came off the stage, and I said, "Well, we have a problem, Mr. Secretary." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, it actually isn't our policy. We don't want them to do that. So you've actually changed U.S. foreign policy." "Oh, is that so?" He said, "Oh, I'll take care of it." Next day, at another press conference, he got up and said, "Just want you guys to know," this is talking to about 40, 50 journalists, Thai journalists, American journalists, "just want you to know I made a mistake yesterday. That is not our policy. We don't." He had no problem about setting things right. And I loved working for him. He was great. It makes working for someone
he was terrific.
a pleasure. Yes.
Matt, I'll tell you one more story. If we were considering a change in foreign policy, a group of us would be summoned, and I'd be there on the press side. The congressional guy would be there, assistant secretary for the area, and Shultz would discuss what it was we were going to do, and then he'd go around the room and say, "What do you think the reaction would be? Press, John, you tell me. Congress, you tell me. The world at large, tell me." And he listened to all this, and then at the end of it he said, well, he would say, "Thank you, gentlemen. Now, what do you think is the right thing to do?" That's pretty impressive.
Do you think that's still done today by his successors?
I'm not about to give you my view of the present administration.
Noted. Okay. Moving on. What happened after you were working for Shultz?
Let's see. Well, my papers, to my chagrin, had done very well in my absence. And they'd grown.
The ones in Cape Cod.
The ones on Cape Cod.
Yeah.
Clearly, we had to buy a new press, which is not inexpensive, to cope with printing our own papers and others. The newspaper was located in a converted gas station in the little town of Orleans. We would need to build a new building. It got very expensive to consider. Neither of my teenage children, although they had worked in the papers, neither of them wanted to be a journalist as a career, so that was not interest. And shortly after that, my then wife left me, and so the time had come to sell them. And so we sold them to a friendly paper in Massachusetts that had a couple of papers down there. We'd always talk with them. If we was to sell them, they would. So the Quincy Patriot Ledger bought our papers. I was sort of wondering what to do then, but an old friend of mine from the Washington Post said, "Why don't we go to Maine and let's have one last run of the dice."
One last fling.
So we went to Maine, we bought a little newspaper, started another newspaper, which was a pretty good newspaper, but that was not the best venture of my life. Starting another newspaper in Maine in the midst of a recession was not one of my better models.
It's a very thickly populated state.
Yeah, sure, yeah. So we sold those. Then Lee Griggs, who had been a night newspaper's executive and was presiding over a foundation that they had made very profitable, called me and said, what do you think we should do with some of this money? I thought about it, but before Lee got back to me, my wife is a Mormon, former journalist. I had gone out to Brigham Young University a couple of times to lecture to the journalist students there, and not everybody left the room, and so we seemed that it was a reasonable success, and they said, "Well, why don't you come and teach here?" Dave Forsyth, who was chairman of the department, journalism department, happened to call me at that moment. And I said, "Well, I was just writing a little memo to Lee Griggs saying I'm not sure we train our foreign correspondents well enough. If you're a big newspaper like the New York Times, sure, you send a guy to Harvard and he learns the language and so on and so on, and he's well prepared. If you're a small paper, old Joe's done pretty well covering City Hall and up in the State House, and maybe we'll send old Joe out. And old Joe gets out there, and he's not entirely sure which continent he's on or what the religion is or what the economics are, and old Joe does his best. And I said, I think that at some great university it would be good to start an international sort of educational center where young journalists who thought they might have an interest in foreign diplomacy coverage and covering diplomacy could specialize in those areas, could go out to be sent on assignment for time to time. And you would bring to that center also distinguished editors and publishers and journalism professors from different countries, mix everybody up for 4 or 5 months, and they'd all learn something. And Dave Forsythe said, oh, we've just had a faculty seminar. That's exactly what we want to do at Brigham Young University. So I went to Brigham Young University and started their program, International Media. And so we sent kids, interns, to Ahram in Cairo for summer. We sent them to Africa. We sent them all over the world. And we brought good professors from different countries to BYU, and it worked very well. We had, at the time of South Africa's first election, first free election, and the first time blacks had ever been allowed to vote in South Africa, 5,000 journalists were out there covering that. And it was a huge press center, and we sent about 15 kids, journalism students from Brigham Young, who had worked on the BYU newspaper called The Daily Universe, rather grandly. So I have to this day, somewhere, a photograph of the 5,000-strong international center, and they all had workstations. So there was a workstation for the New York Times with their banner, and right next to it is the banner for the Daily Universe, Provo, Utah. Anyway, those kids came back. Absolutely, their lives were changed. I mean, those kinds of experiences were terrific.
And they became journalists.
I
want to move into an area that you are uniquely qualified for. Maybe not uniquely, but you may say not. I believe so. And that is the present state of the 21st century, the status of news reporting, which of course is supported by revenues from sales, which in turn are hard to do on paper. It's all, quote, gone to the web, which many people expect for free. And that business model is in great turmoil. So I'd like you to comment about that now, and then later on I'll be asking you questions about the future. And you're dealing with the future by being at a very highly rated journalism school in Provo. But the fact remains, everyone needs to earn a living. Can journalists earn a living in this day and age, and can they earn a living in the future?
Well, the print newspaper is an eclipse, clearly. I mean, even the New York Times is undergoing a tremendous, they've just had a change at the leadership of the New York Times, the editorial leadership, as they wrestle with the transformation to the web, to the new technology. And I've heard the publisher of the New York Times say, I'm not sure we're going to have a print newspaper 5 years from now. The problem is that the transition, advertising is the key, the transition from print advertising to the web was incredibly fast. Very few people realized it was going to hit that hard, and it did, and the advertising for print newspapers vanished. So most of your favorite print newspapers are either out of business and trying to make the web profitable, which is very hard because the web advertising is nowhere near yet reached what it was in print. And all that is going on. Now, having said that, there are some niches that some smart people are developing where they have a kind of a niche audience for print newspapers. Like in San Francisco, there's a newspaper that circulates in coffee shops. People read newspapers in coffee shops, okay? But these are, and there's some foundations that are shoveling some money towards existing newspapers. But most newspapers are much, much thinner than they are. But I don't think it is an end to journalism. I do think there's some perils in the web, because the problem with the web and the little metal thing you hand in your hand, that's where you get your news. The problem about that is that anybody can get onto that means of delivery and publish truth or fiction. So you have to be very careful about whose eye on the news you're reading and considering. What I tell my students is the means of delivery is changing, but the world is greatly in need of young journalists like you who are going to go out there with good ethics, a good sense of being accurate as well as trying to be first, and are skilled in the art of telling you the truth, holding off, because there have been some terrible situations where congressmen have been declared dead and they're not dead, and that kind of stuff.
But how does the reader, such as myself, know what I'm reading has been filtered as, quote, true or not true? I mean, who's the judge?
Well, that's the problem. The reader has a tough job judging. Are you going to read the London Economist, or are you going to read the supermarket paper?
So it amounts to reputation.
It amounts to reputation, but also diligence on the viewer's part. If you are a serious user of news, you can make judgments about which publication or which web you're reading and test them for accuracy over a period of time.
Do you think there are people who actually are that analytical and decide what to believe, or they just hear what they hear?
Well, for example, take the Christian Science Monitor. One of the most heartbreaking assignments I've ever had a few years ago was a request from the trustees of the Monitor to go back and be a consultant to tell them what should happen to the print Christian Science Monitor. It's the love of my life, and I had spent 20 years with it, and never did I think I would be recommending the end of the daily Christian Science Monitor.
The printed version.
When you looked at the figures, they were unanswerable. In my time as editor, the circulation has been about 280,000. It's not huge, but respectable. It had dropped to about 50,000. Clearly, the daily Monitor could not continue to exist on that basis. But they were racking up about 10 million views on the Christian Science Monitor web. I said to the trustees, was working with another consultant, the two of us said, we think you should keep a foot in print, and therefore we think you should have a weekly. We will glad to design a mock-up for you, which we did. And they transferred the entire 15,000 circulation to the new weekly, and that has grown, as my understanding. I think it's about 80,000. I may be wrong on that, but I think it's about 80,000 now. And on the web, they're getting huge, but you don't make money on the web.
That's going back to one of my original questions.
Right.
What of the future for journalism?
Well, various institutions are wanting to charge for it, but it's kind of hard to get them to charge when you gave it to them free for a number of years. So that's an uphill battle, but that's one. That's one way that the news organizations will attempt to continue in existence. I think the Monitor's content is still. Well, I used to work there, so I'll be careful, but I won't sound like I'm boasting. But I think most viewers of both the print weekly and the web regard the Monitor content as something they can trust.
And it's just now a matter of being crowded out by an ever-expanding number of news outlets.
Yeah.
Which brings me to a question I'd like to hear you speak about, which is, because of all these changes, especially economic support for journalism, meaning reporters, what has happened to investigative reporting?
You put your finger on the two sad stories. One is investigative reporting, and the other is foreign reporting, and both are expensive. Investigative reporting, you may suspect the mayor is on the take. So your investigative reporter goes down in the basement of City Hall, and he goes through the tax records for the last 3 years to find whether there's something there that the mayor is fiddling, and so forth and so on. That is very expensive.
Because of the time involved.
Because he may come back and say, I'm quite sure the mayor's a crook, but there's nothing there that we can publish without getting into a libel suit. Or maybe the lawyer in the newsroom says, too dangerous, can't publish this one, you haven't got it.
So back in the early days in New York City, when you heard about the Boss Tweed racket that happened, if Boss Tweed existed today, would he have been uncovered?
I don't know, can't answer that, but I think a lot of stuff is not getting covered because papers of necessity have moved away from that. And the same goes for foreign coverage. It's very expensive to keep a foreign correspondent abroad. You're probably talking for a major newspaper like the Times or the Monitor, you're probably talking $400,000-500,000 a year. Sounds a lot, but he's out in a region. He's got to travel in the region. He may have to have an interpreter if he doesn't know the language. His kids are out there. They've got to go to school. There's home leave. It adds up. So it's very expensive. And I fear that foreign correspondence is also being cut back.
What do you envision as a solution or prognosis on all this?
Well, I happen to read the Christian Science Monitor, but I also happen to read The Economist. I also happen to read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I think that those organizations are doing a respectable job given the cutbacks that they're all taking.
What can be done to turn this around?
I think it's a question of time. It's a question of time, and whether the what is free or near free at the moment, whether readers can be induced to pay for that or not, I don't know.
What part does the age of the population, as it changes, as when we're our age, clearly in our senior years, we grew up with newspapers. Our only choice is newspapers and radio, and later on to some degree mass TV. Now, radio and TV are not even of note.
Right.
Print is not of note, to some, other than reputation. Today, if you want to get, quote, the truth, some hard facts with reputation, it's still if it comes out in a major newspaper.
Yeah, that's right. It's hard. If you talk to young people, talk to people in their late teens or even early 20s, and you ask them where they get their news, Jon Stewart.
I've heard that. That's why I'm asking the question.
They're not reading newspapers.
Right. I mean, our kids are a newspaper. What's that?
Yeah.
So we hear all the numbers of circulation dropping, but when you actually track the circulation numbers to the age cohorts involved, the seniors is what's supporting a lot of the print journalism.
Right. That's absolutely right.
Kids in their 20s and 30s, a print newspaper, who's got time for that?
Yeah.
And they are going to be, in 20 years, 50 years old.
Yeah.
And that's where the sweet spot is for advertising. What's this going to lead to?
Well, it's a one-by-one thing. For example, I had a student, a very good student. He had been editor of the college newspaper in Provo, in the People Union LSD. And we had good internship program, and we sent a lot of interns over summer to New York, and we got him an internship with Newsweek. And he came to me and he said, so what do I do in this changing climate? And I said, well, what you do, you go, no matter what they give you to do it, but also make your number with other editors on Newsweek who you're not working for. Go around, see them, ask them if there's anything you can do for them. Write stories they haven't asked for, try that, bounce it off them, and show that you are, you've got lots of fire and energy. Well, little did I know that during his internship, Newsweek was to be sold for $1 and its debt. But he had done so well in establishing himself well in the first part of his internship that the organization decided to keep him on. And now he's a leading political writer, and he will be okay. But it's going to be an individual thing. Find, if you've got fire in your belly and you've got talent, you will find there is a niche that you can fill.
As I gather now, the physical business of printed newspapers pay for it, so there'll be money and revenue and the advertising, all that. That's pretty much going by the boards.
It's a tough uphill sell.
So what's left, of course, is the news.
Yes.
Those who are reporting on it, those who are filtering it, namely editors and journalism.
That's right.
And the method of delivery.
That's right.
Is that a hopeful thing?
It's tough. It's tough. People are paying attention, for example, to what's happening abroad. Usually, interest in foreign affairs is fairly slender.
The world is getting smaller.
The world is getting smaller, and we've got Russia on the move, and the Ukraine, and that kind of stuff, and we've got Syria, and we've got a whole bunch of stuff where the Foxes and the CNNs. CNN has always done a fairly good job, I think, of foreign coverage. But even the ones that have not traditionally been strong in foreign coverage necessarily have to offer comment and analysis and so forth and so on what is going on in the world.
With your sage-like perspective, if you had a magic wand, what would you do?
Well, I do have. I have 3 children. None of them are in the newspaper business. But that doesn't mean that I don't encourage young people with fire in the belly and a passion for journalism, because I tell them you will find an audience and you will find a medium, but probably won't be print newspapers. But there is always a venue out there somewhere for you to communicate what you think is important.
Which brings me to, I believe, my last question. Neutrality and balance and filtering as a journalist working with an editor, is that more important or less important versus what would appear to be those who have what I call raw opinions or strong opinions, have perspectives which really shouldn't be in the equation but do, but that's what seems to be popular. And that's a terrible tug and pull there. And then in the middle of it is the reader who wouldn't know which battle they're in. What would you think that's going? Where's that going?
Well, as I say, what I tell them is, okay, the means of delivery is changing, but the basic principles of journalism, fairness, depth, coverage, all those remain the same if you are to be serious about being a journalist. It is a problem, the New Yorker cartoon of the dog sitting at the computer, and he's typing away, and there's a dog sitting beside him, and he's looking down at the dog, because the dog at the side has clearly asked him a question. So the dog who's typing at the computer says, once you're on the computer, they don't know you're a dog. So you need to be, that's the problem. So you either got to get a very smart dog to go on the computer, or you better get a journalist who's been trained in ethics and fairness and depth, and not flash and not dazzle.
On that positive note, I'd like to thank you for your time with It's So Interesting. I've been speaking with John Hughes.
Thank you. I enjoyed very much our conversation.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting. It's interesting.